Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the greatest military disasters in all of history. In 1812, the most powerful army Europe had ever seen, led by a legendary general, marched into Russia. Just 6 months later, it was completely annihilated. So let's start with a number. In June of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Russia with this many men, 685,000. That's not just an army, it's basically a moving city, bigger than almost any city in Europe at the time.
And this is the number of soldiers who made it out. Not even 6 months later, a mere fraction of that original force stumbled back across the border. They were a ghost of an army.
So how in the world did this happen? Now, you've probably heard the simple answer, General Winter, the brutal Russian cult. But, that's not even half the story. The truth is way more fascinating. It was a perfect storm of failures that doomed this army long before the first snowflake ever fell. Okay, first, to really get a handle on just how big this disaster was, you have to understand what was lost. We need to talk about the Grande Armée itself, a force that pretty much everyone at the time considered invincible.
I mean, this wasn't just any army. This thing was a legend in its own time. It was a modern war machine that had crushed the old empires of Europe. It ran on merit, not your family name, and its tactics had literally redrawn the map of the continent.
But here's the catch. Its greatest strength was also a massive hidden weakness. It was a truly pan-European army, sure, but that meant only about 60% of the troops were actually French. This whole mix of nationalities, languages, and loyalties, well, it looked amazing on the parade ground. But when things got tough, that unity was going to start to crack. And the cracks were already showing before the invasion even began. Thousands of miles away from Russia, the French Empire was already bleeding out from a war it just couldn't win.
You see, for years this brutal conflict in Spain had become a black hole for Napoleon's resources. It was sucking up his best veteran soldiers and tons of money, exactly the men and resources he would desperately need for Russia.
The Spanish didn't fight Napoleon's kind of war. Oh no. They basically perfected guerrilla warfare, turning the countryside into a death trap. For the French soldiers, there was no front line, just the constant nagging fear of ambushes and raids on their supply lines. And this quote from a Prussian officer, man, it just sums it up perfectly. How do you fight an enemy you can never really find? You can't just win one big battle and call it a day. It was a frustrating, demoralizing, and never-ending fight. Even Napoleon knew how bad it was. He called it his Spanish ulcer, a wound that just wouldn't heal. So the crucial point is, the Grande Armée marching into Russia was already weakened, already stretched thin, before it even saw a single Russian soldier. All right, so the stage is set. But the real nightmare for the Grande Armée, it didn't start with the famous Russian winter. It started in the blistering, unforgiving heat of the summer.
Napoleon wanted that one big knockout battle to end the war quickly. But the Russians, they just wouldn't play his game. Instead, they retreated deeper and deeper into their own massive country. And as they went, they burned everything, leaving nothing for the French to eat or use.
I want you to just think about that for a second. By the time he got to Moscow, more than half of his army was already gone. We're talking over 300,000 men. Dead from disease like typhus, dead from heat exhaustion, or they just deserted. And this was all before winter even started. The army was a shell of its former self.
So Napoleon finally gets to his big prize, Moscow. But it wasn't a prize at all. It was a trap.
He marched into a ghost town that was on fire. He waited there for over a month, expecting the Tsar to surrender. But the offer never came. He had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Stranded hundreds of miles from his supplies with winter right around the corner, he had no choice. He had to retreat.
Now, it's almost impossible to put into words what happened next, the sheer horror of it. But believe it or not, one of the best ways to understand the scale of this collapse comes from a chart, a famous data visualization created decades later. This data, inspired by that masterpiece, tells a horrifying story. You've got two brutal facts marching side by side. As the temperature just plummets, the army simply dissolves. This wasn't a retreat, it was a death march. Starving, freezing men were being hunted by Cossacks and stalked by a cold so intense it could kill you in your sleep.
So this brings us all the way back to our original question. Was it really just the winter that destroyed the most powerful army on Earth? Well, the evidence tells a very different story.
You see, General Winter is a great story.
It's simple, it's dramatic. But the reality is, winter was just the final blow. It was the nail in the coffin for an army that was already dying from a dozen other wounds.
It was a complete domino effect. The supply lines were too long, the Russian strategy was brilliant, the summer losses were staggering, the war in Spain had already bled them dry, and maybe most importantly, Napoleon's own arrogance. His complete underestimation of Russia led him into the trap. The winter didn't cause the disaster, it just finished the job. So what can we take away from all this? It's a pretty powerful reminder, right? That even the most brilliant generals and the mightiest armies can be broken. Not just by other soldiers, but by distance, by disease, by logistics, and by the sheer will of a people who refuse to break. It proves that even the greatest empires have their limits.